So the Iran war is picking back up, and there is no clear end in sight. I mean, a deal has been right around the corner for about 2 months, with the entire region sitting on edge. This weekend, we even saw a resumption of military strikes between Israel and Iran, making it seem like a return to war might happen before an actual peace deal. So to better understand this situation, we're joined today by Jonathan Hackett. Jonathan is a retired U.S. Marine interrogator, counterintelligence agent, and special operations intelligence officer, and he recently authored a book titled Iran's Shadow Weapons, where he dives into how the Iranian regime is driven by a mixture of paranoia, greed, and cold rationality. That book, as well as where you can find Jonathan, will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. A lot changed in the last 24, 48 hours here with the U.S., Iran, Israel, and all of that. But just at a high level, as we sit here recording the morning of June 8th, where do things sit in this conflict?
Well, right now you've got kind of a tension because there are three main actors, Iran, U.S., Israel, and only two of them are negotiating directly with each other. It's kind of a recipe for a disaster here because if you're not including the third actor, you're going to have these exact frictions where if you're looking at them all acting against each other, I mean, Israel and U.S. are partners in this conflict, but they're both independent states. So they have their own interests, their own end states they're looking for. Obviously, Iran has the same thing. But there's still a conflict going on between Israel and Iran one-on-one, separate from the United States, and that has been going on. So you see some of this kind of rippling to the surface while the U.S. and Iran are trying to reach a separate peace, essentially, from what's going on with Israel's domestic and regional interests around it that are kind of spoiling those bilateral U.S.-Iranian discussions.
That's a good point. I think it's glossed over a lot. I think it's getting more attention the longer this goes on, but U.S. and Israeli interests align a lot of times, just like any country in the world. We have interests that align, but never 100%. As we sit here today, what do you see as the biggest issues where the U.S. and Israel maybe don't overline or don't have the same goals in mind? Or is that clear?
Well, certainly. I mean, there's one problem, and that's distance. The U.S. is very far away from the Middle East. Israel's in it. So they feel a lot more immediate concern, acute concern about what's happening with forces in other countries around them. Whereas the U.S. has, the advantage of huge ocean, lots of allies in between, lots of partners in between, and also control over the economic system in the world. So there's a lot of things that insulate the United States from what's going on in the Middle East, where the Israeli political system feels a lot more sensitivity to what's going on. The same exact event, like a shooting across a border between Syria and Lebanon to America seems kind of this far off distant issue. Whereas to Israel, that might be a thing that has to be solved right now.
Have you noticed pressure inside of Israel to push this along? Because it feels like we're in a spot in the U.S. We're just, I don't know, man. It's like 60 days of it's going to restart or we're the deal is around the corner. It seems like there would be more pressure in Israel to finish this, for lack of a better term. Have you noticed anything like that?
Yeah, there are actually domestic political reasons that Israel's feeling this, not necessarily about security, but about elections in particular.
Okay.
There's a coalition government there. Not everybody agrees with each other. In fact, almost nobody agrees with each other, and it's designed that way on purpose. And you have this bloc that's leading the war, and there are a lot of people opposed to it for different reasons, and they've been opposed to it since before October 7th, 2023. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the street against the current government system right now. So that sentiment's not gone. Netanyahu and his group are looking at this and saying, hey, we have elections coming up in September. The U.S. has elections coming up in November. There's going to be a change probably in some way that's not going to be a positive change for the way the governing direction is going. And I think what they're trying to do is hurry and get this stuff done before those two election moments occur in the United States and in Israel. And actually, Iran's looking at this too and saying, hey, there are two democratic systems right now fighting a war against us. We are an autocracy. We get to control the narrative and timeline as long as we want to for in any direction we want. If we can just keep going past September in Israel and November in the United States, we might just win this thing by not losing, which is a classic kind of guerrilla strategy. Even though it's a state actor, they're looking at it, they have a longer time horizon, whereas Israeli domestic politics have a very short time horizon. Again, not necessarily linked to security. In some ways, it's linked to economic problems. Like yesterday, the Israeli stock market took a nosedive. A lot of people lost money. Like the average person's like, well, I'm losing money. I'm in danger. I had to go down to my bunker 5 times yesterday. I've lost my money. I don't know about what's going on tomorrow. Same in the United States, although Americans don't really, I think, generally understand Middle East nuances, that's fine. But at the gas pump, they're like, why am I paying $6 for diesel? This has to end. I can't sustain that. Especially, average American income is like 55K a year. That's very expensive. You're talking about home heating oil and things like that. Then, other US partners in Southeast Asia that get all of their natural gas and from Qatar, for example, they can't even have cooking oil. They can't even cook dinner. So there's these like kind of home issues, like domestic issues, not just the US and Israel, but also in partners that are pressuring the US and Israel to get this thing done immediately so that people can go back to the way things were. Unfortunately, I think it's idealistic to think they actually will go back to the way they truly were before the start on February 28th.
Yeah, it feels like a synthetic deadline that we're putting on it with November. That doesn't, and it's one that Iran is specifically pushing back on. Like you mentioned, they know it too. Do you have an idea, or what would be your estimate as to what the Iranian strategy is right now? They've survived, I think is safe to say, but what do you think their plan is day in and day out?
Well, it's really twofold. It's to survive and to entrench. And we see this happen a lot. So when the US or Israel or some other actor threatens Iran, the big example is the Saddam Hussein's invasion, 1980, the Iran-Iraq War. The country today was forged from those 8 years of combat, which were actually the longest conventional war in the 20th century on the planet. Hugely costly in lives and treasure. And they built their structure around this concept of survival. They are willing to outlast to the very last man. If it means there's just one regime elite left, to them, that's victory. Whereas on our side, we're extremely sensitive to casualties. We have very expensive and exquisite equipment, a $30 million missile to shoot down a $30,000 drone, which is just crazy cost asymmetries that we have that they understand, and they're exploiting that. And so that the more that they're able to exploit that without us actually understanding that we're being exploited, the more they see a victory on the horizon. And again, that victory is just not losing. It's not that they want to have this big splashing win or a big handshake and a deal. They just want to sustain themselves, survive, entrench, and actually look at the Straits of Hormuz as a great example. Before the war started, they did not control the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, most of it's in Omani territorial waters, 12 nautical miles. Today, they do control it. Not only do they control it, they're profiting from it. So it's not just a territorial control, it's also an economic win for them in a country that's heavily sanctioned and has no participation in the international system because we kicked them out of it in 2017. So we, the United States, have actually provided an opening for them to entrench and to survive. And another example of that is the cost of oil sales that Iran has had after February 28th. They've actually gotten more oil revenues since the war started than before the war started because Chinese purchasers continued purchasing and they bought it at a premium. So in fact, the US has actually been helping to support Iran's increased oil sales indirectly.
I feel like in many ways in this conflict, we've kind of walked ourselves into a corner where we, at the beginning of the conflict, when we opened we allowed some of the vessels on the sea to continue shipping Iranian oil. It's like, no. But we keep tripping up on some of this stuff. You mentioned the Iranian elite willing to go to the last man. And I was interested in how that compares the regime right now and the relationship with the people to the Iran-Iraq war. Because even if the regime is ready to go to the last person, are the Iranian people? And I would assume there's some number in there where the answer is no. A lot of them, unfortunately, killed in the protests. But they do not have, unless I'm mistaken, 100% popular support. So is there a tipping point? Do you have any idea where that tipping point very ballpark, where that tipping point might be?
There's actually been a lot of studies on this that say that if 5% of the population is willing to actually resist actively, that's enough of a catalyst in numerous case studies in the 20th century, which can be a lot of people, but it's actually, I don't think, a truly accurate hypothesis. I think that has been selected upon in a biased selection, so I can go off on that. But I think what's happening in Iran is there's one problem. Even if you have 95% resistance, where are the guns? Where is the means? You need a thing. You need like active things in the environment to help you actually get that momentum in a place that can do something. So you think about like the protests in January. There were millions of people protesting in every city across the country. And I'm sure you saw the maps, the heat map of like every major city had many, many people on the streets. But Iran's very smart. They know that if the people don't have weapons, it's very hard for them to resist. And guns are not lawfully owned in Iran unless you're a hunter and you're allowed to have a single, loading shotgun or a rifle, like a hunting rifle. And those are only for people like up in the mountains. That's not people in the cities. So the people have been denuded of their weapons. They can't go access them. The only people that have weapons are the security forces. And actually, during that January protest, they brought Iraqis, Pakistanis, and Afghan militia fighters into Iran to patrol the streets to help bolster against these unarmed civilians that were out there protesting. And I'm sure you've seen the videos of how it was slaughter of automatic weapons fired into crowds. People with no ability to resist beyond their voices and beyond just showing up. And actually, Iran also notices that the information domain is a real domain of warfare, not just from conventional forces, but also their domestic audiences. That's why they turned the internet off in February. It's because they knew that if people could coordinate out into the streets, they would be able to have a mass movement, maybe perhaps coalesce together even without the weapons. Maybe they could convince the army, the Artesh, which is not the IRGC, to join them, which would be the necessary element because the Artesh does have weapons. But they couldn't because the internet was turned off for almost 60 days. They could not communicate with the outside world except with Starlink, which they were executing people for having it, like summary executions for having it, and other means of communication. They were going after people for that. So it's a very interesting case because I think no other time, let's say in the past 100 years of cases we've got, there wasn't a situation like this where people not only had no weapons, but also no ability to communicate. They don't like the regime. There's numbers thrown around, but something like 90% of people don't like the regime for various reasons, not the same reason. But they can't communicate with each other and say, hey, let's on Friday night show up and protest. They can't even do that. So these people are basically shut in and suppressed, not just repressed, but suppressed. So the sentiment exists, but it's very hard for them to actually get out. And it's important to contrast that with the elites that you were talking about, because the elites have enemies, Israel, United States. The Iranian people have an enemy. It's the Iranian government, and they can't fight it. So the Iranian government has the power in this situation, the very strong, control over the ability of people to resist. And again, those people are not united. There are people in Azerbaijan province or Balochistan province, totally different ethnic groups, different languages, different histories. They don't have a unified leader. And if the leader of one of those groups stood up and was like, hey, I'm now leading the resistance, the other group would be like, no, you're not. You're not our ethnic group. You're not from our area of the country. So, and the Iranian government's done a very good job since the 80s of making sure there is no unification across the country. There's 32 provinces, hundreds of languages spoken. They're very good at dividing that on purpose. So that kind of like the British Empire, where it was like, hey, we don't want any of these guys working together because if they do, they're definitely going to come after us. So the best thing to do is just keep them fighting each other. And that's what they've been doing since 1980.
But so you mentioned the lack of communication with the internet being shut down. If I'm not mistaken, they started turning it back on recently.
They did.
What do you read into that?
Yeah, President Pezeshkian seems to be at odds with the IRGC. So there's a couple of different blocks that are kind of holding levers of power right now. And since the war started, you could tell that Pezeshkian, the president, who's quite powerless, to be frank, has been kind of opposed to what's going on with the way the IRGC is conducting this war. And the IRGC has been vocal in saying that, Pezeshkian doesn't know what he's talking about, et cetera. There's a lot of domestic politics in the propaganda too, even though it's meant for external consumption. You can actually see kind of the tension between them in there. He's been the one trying to push the internet back on. I think probably because his camp is the main negotiating camp with the outside world. And so they're trying to make concessions to show the outside world that they're serious about getting things back under control. Whereas the IRGC, like Ahmad Vahidi, who's the commander of the IRGC now, extreme hardliner, very much against any kind of engagement with the West, does not support negotiations, does not support turning the internet back on. It seems that Pezeshkian won out temporarily, but I assume that if there are some more protests that kind of bubble up, Vahidi will say, I told you so, and they're going to shut the internet off again. And then they're going to have an even more extreme, violent reaction to the protesters.
So that leads to there's some speculation as soon as the talks kicked off that there was a disconnect between the IRGC, maybe the more hardline components, and the more moderates that were seeking some sort of negotiated settlement, to the point where people were saying that negotiations can't happen because you're going to have the negotiators off in Pakistan is where they were at. And meanwhile, the IRGC is going to be slinging missiles at Israel just to show that they don't have control over this group. How does that look right now? Was that maybe a little more exaggerated at the time? Has it faded back?
I think we don't see a unification yet domestically in their political camps. I think they're a little bit quieter because perhaps the things we are not seeing in the negotiations, the secret part, which is the whole thing should be secret. It shouldn't be happening on Twitter. But the parts that are happening
Too
in
bad.
secret, yeah, right. The parts that are happening in secret, I think probably are a little bit enticing, perhaps, to the IRGC. For example, the $24 billion of frozen assets that would be unfrozen before the agreement would occur, which, of course, Trump says that's not real, that's not in there. But how did he get that number to protest against it? Anyways, it's actually in there. It's $24 billion. And then another $24 billion would be released. This is IRGC money. They want their money. They've wanted their money for a long time. It's actually appreciated in value since it's been frozen. And if you look actually economically at the IRGC, they control the entire black market. In fact, the Central Bank of Iran has said that the IRGC controls 78% of the black market. If Iran's central bank says that in an official statement, you can imagine it's probably more than that. But a lot of the dollars they control, like US dollar currency, it's not in Iran. It's in Europe. They hold it in banks like Bank Melli in London. There's one in Hamburg. There's one in Moscow. There's one in the Cayman Islands. They're all over Europe and kind of Europe affiliated banks and Hong Kong. Like when they sell oil, the money doesn't go to Iran. It goes to a bank in Hong Kong and then goes to Berlin, for example. The IRGC wants access to that money. It's a lot of money. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. It's like sovereign wealth fund that they can't really work with the way they want to. And they put a lot of capital in Europe, especially in real estate portfolios. Like in January, there was like $100 million of real estate that Mojtaba Khomeini bought. Somehow, even though he has no income and he's a religious official, was able to buy really nice luxury flats. Yeah. But this is what the IRGC is thinking is how do we get back in control of those assets that we own? And this is really the Iranian people's money, but they don't see it that way. They see it as their pocketbook and they want access to it. And I think part of the deal that's being negotiated is really pointing to that, hey, if you guys do come to the table and kind of turn down what you've been doing, you're going to get that financial outcome that you're looking for. And I think that's probably what they're hoping for.
Something I don't understand in this sense, and this was brought up, I'm going to steal Aaron McLean's idea from a couple weeks ago. Why does Iran not just lie and tell Trump what he wants to hear? And it's going to be some sort of flimsy agreement, a memorandum of understanding, and they get some funds unlocked, and then they just go back to doing what they were doing. It seems like they're really digging in with the negotiations, and it seems like they maybe could have made some progress if they just lied right out the gate. I don't know. Any thoughts on why they're not doing anything like that?
It's actually very interesting if you look at from 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the nuclear deal. Since that time, they've been a good faith negotiator generally. They've actually upheld every agreement that they've entered into, which is very fascinating. Like, as you said, like why? And I think it's because maybe the outside viewer doesn't realize, there's things you say and do in an agreement, and then there are covert and clandestine things you do behind the scenes, even though you have an agreement. And that's not Iran. That's every country. That's like the theory of international relations, that there's stuff we do publicly and stuff we do privately. And they're very good at the private stuff. Covert action, for example, before Bashar al-Assad left Syria, Iran was basically training their entire military to do things that, saying they weren't, but they were. And we were letting them do it because they were fighting ISIS. So there was like this kind of behind the scenes agreement that just leave them alone in Syria because they're doing our work for us. Similar in Lebanon, the Lebanese armed forces can't defend the South because it's led by a Christian president who doesn't want to send forces to the South to defend the country. Well, Hezbollah's there and Hezbollah's doing it. Well, they're not doing it with their own money. Iran's sending them $1 billion a year. That's their budget since 2017 when we exited the JCPOA. So there is this stuff going on behind the scenes where if Iran does agree to a deal, they'll uphold pieces of it. But they're going to also creatively think about how can we still do what we want and uphold the deal. And they kind of did that with the nuclear deal where, they said they would stop the enrichment and they kind of listened to that, although there was some, talk of them not doing it. But at the same time, they just moved to surrogate forces instead and like really dramatically increased support to Yemen and Lebanon and also Kataib Hezbollah and other Shia groups in Iraq while they were upholding this agreement. So they're like really reading it carefully. And they're saying, okay, we are absolutely following the letter of this agreement and we're doing these other creative things to still do our national policy objectives. Again, that's what a lot of countries do. And you could say it's honest. You could also say it's not honest, but that's countries acting in their own interests, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we can probably agree that if the IRGC, if the Iranian leadership came out and said something like, we will not pursue nuclear weapons, the Strait of Hormuz is open, like whatever it is, our government would probably jump on it and say, we did it, great accomplishment. Whether or not that played out over the course of even a week, let alone months and years, I don't know. It's been interesting that Iran hasn't try to take advantage of. I think that's a weakness in our negotiating position. And it looks like Iran hasn't tried to take advantage of that for any number of reasons.
Yeah, I think they're trying to get the most out of this deal they can legitimately before even being deceitful or anything. I think they want to see what can we get. And I think Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, said it well. He said that the Straits of Hormuz is Iran's new nuclear weapon. In other words, they realize that there is a negotiating power of this asset that they now control that is so strong that it can force any other state to do what they want, or at least bring them to the table. Because if they didn't control the Straits right now, they wouldn't be in this negotiating position that they are in with the United States. The US is basically treating them like a peer adversary at the table. Iran is not a peer adversary. I hate to break it to the regime. You know, they're a regional power, sure, but they're not as strong as Israel. They're not as strong as the United States by far, or by any NATO partner that can be allied with the United States fighting under Article 5, for example. So it's this thing they control that's giving them this extra kind of boost. It's very similar. You hear this comparison a lot. North Korea compared to Libya, Muammar Gaddafi versus Kim Jong-un. The reason Kim Jong-un survived is because he had a nuclear weapon. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, and very soon after, he was dead on the street. And there's this thing, especially in the Iranian regime, they see that. They're like, hey, what should we do? Should we give up our nukes? No. Because if we do, we're going to end up in the street. I mean, there's guys bombing us right now while we have the material. What happens when we give up the material? And I think they're looking at it that way, and they're saying, let's try to extract as much as we can out of this agreement, and then probably pursue some things behind the scenes. Very similar to 2003, the Ayatollah then said, we will not have a nuclear program because it's against Islam, and there was a fatwa they put out. Well, then the next year it was released, they had a nuclear program. So for a period of time, there's this feeling like, oh, they're not doing it. But of course they're doing it. I mean, it's in their survival interest to keep doing it. And especially now, they've been attacked by the superpower. Of course, they're going to, as soon as they're able to, they're going to start reconstituting this program. And it's important to note that, 10, 15 years ago, during JCPOA negotiations, they had to get their centrifuges from Siemens, which is a German company. Now they can produce them in Natanz. They can actually make their own centrifuges. They have the technology to do it. So this is a big jump where they're like, hey, let's make an organic capability to make a nuclear program. Even if you destroy it now, we will restart again.
We're going to leave some of the hardest questions here for the end. So two-parter here for you, Jonathan. The first part, does Iran think that they have the upper hand in these negotiations? And the second part of that question, does their perception match reality?
Yeah, so it's interesting when you analyze what they say for their domestic consumption versus outside the country. In Farsi media that's directed at the Iranian people, it sounds like the U.S. has been defeated, physically, like the U.S. has been blown up. The government's toppling. There's a coup. It's actually very fascinating to see it because it's so crazy and so detached from reality. But then there's that English world discussion, especially on X, because that's where Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, usually puts out his messaging, and some other IRGC officials do that too. It's a lot more toned down, and it's clearly not targeted at general audiences. It's targeted at specific segments of consumption. So some of the messages will be targeted at Trump himself. And you can tell this is not written for anybody else, but for Trump to read and get upset about and cause some behavior. There are other messages that are put out that are supposed to affect American domestic audiences so that they get upset at the polls in November and go vote different people out of office. That's interesting. So I think they have their narrative. I don't think they believe all of it. But as I said before, they have an information domain that they see as a place of warfare. And they're using Twitter, they're using Truth Social, they're using Lego animations, as we've talked about. I mean, this is very fascinating to see how they've dramatically used AI as a tool to actually access audiences who wouldn't otherwise be interested in the conflict. There are Americans going on X and seeing these videos and sharing them because they're interesting and funny to watch. They have no interest in the war, but they're like, oh, that's really cool. Let me just share that. And you've just helped the regime share its narrative. It's kind of amazing that they understand that the power of these platforms in a way that maybe we do understand, but we're not using it to its extent that we could. And I think that's where that kind of, do they believe it, do they not believe it comes in? I think it's a really nuanced answer. I think they believe parts of it, but there are other parts that are just designed for others to watch and to be influenced by.
Gotcha. And then, yeah, it's wild to be actively fighting a war where our adversaries can post on social media for our citizens to see. I know ISIS was kind of dabbling that a little bit, but for the most part, you had to be in some dark corners of the internet to be regularly consuming ISIS media. Not now.
It was
to
all
your point,
violent.
The Lego videos. What's that?
It was all violent back then. It wasn't just funny or interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the platforms would take it down. Like there's a nasty execution or a beheading or something. It's up for a period of time, and then you got to, some dark corner website only hosts it. Now these Lego videos, oh my God, they're everywhere. The last one here, Jonathan, I really appreciate the time, but if it feels to me like we've been a little bit stuck for a period of time. Maybe if we have to put a date on it, maybe the start of the ceasefire. It feels like not a lot has changed since then, my opinion. But if President Trump were to call and said, Jonathan, come in, sit down with the National Security Council, what should we do to move this along in a direction beneficial to the United States? What would you recommend?
So what we have to do is shift from a focus on the military instrument of national power to a diplomatic and economic combination, which I think we've been very slow to do. It's kind of, we've been playing catch up on especially the diplomatic side of these, because of course we don't have easy diplomatic channels, although they exist, but they're not easy to use. And those need to be dramatically opened, because we have to remember, you have to know your enemy and know yourself if you want to win 1,000 battles. Sun Tzu said that. I think we fail to really understand their mindset on the other side. Saving face for them is extremely important. There has to be a way for every time something is announced or done that they lose a little bit of something materially, there has to be a way for it to look like it's okay because of some explanation that allows them to save face. If you remember 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war ended and Iran actually surrendered and gave up and stopped, they said they were drinking from the poison chalice and it was a sacrifice that they would have to make to save their people, right? That's what Ayatollah Khamenei said. And then with the nuclear program and things, they said, this is, or the nuclear agreement, they said that this was a heroic compromise. Like the way that it was framed was very important for the regime to say to themselves. And I think with a diplomatic emphasis, we can actually provide them the ability to do that, so they can kind of step back and still lose a little bit, but feel like they're winning something too. And I think that's really important. And if we attach the economic piece to it, you can have a stick all day long, but you need a carrot too. The carrot can have conditions, but it needs to be there. They can't just feel like they're being beaten to submission. I think World War I is a great example of that. The German reparations. I mean, that directly led to Weimar Republic and the worst inflation crisis in Western history, because of the way that the reparations were structured, just to punish them. There was no incentive for them to actually improve later. It was that France wanted them to pay. And I think that right now Iran is thinking that way, that they're going to punish us if we don't get back something. So even if we the West are not going to give them everything they want, they need to feel like they're getting something, like they're winning a little bit of something. And they need to do it publicly for themselves to consume, to feel like they've actually got something here.
It's complicated.
Certainly. That's war.
I mean, I understand it. I know in business, there's an argument around, it doesn't have to be zero sum. If both parties win, it's great. I'm hesitant to apply that here because I don't want to say, can we get to a spot where Iran wins these negotiations? Like, that's not what we're looking for. But yeah, there's something in there where they have to feel confident enough to present it to the people and say, that's good enough for us. Oh, man. You find that answer, Jonathan. Make it public. Let us know.
Trying.
Share it for our wall. Hey, man, really appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so thank you again to Jonathan for taking the time. You can find his newest book, Iran Shadow Weapons, linked in the description below, so be sure to check that out. I just want to say how dynamic this situation has been. Jonathan and I connected a couple weeks ago when everything was pretty calm, all things considered, just the negotiations back and forth. Then we hit record, 6 hours after Israel and Iran exchanged blows for the first time in, a couple months at this point. So yeah, it's changing day by day, but really awesome to get Jonathan's insights here. Very clearly well tied into the region and very well versed in all things Iran related. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.